Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center for American Progress. We are glad to have you with us at our event, A Look Back on the Biden Administration's First Year on Religious Liberty. My name is Maggie Siddiqui, and I am Senior Director of the Religion and Faith team here at CAP. First, as a logistical note, the event is closed captioned. You can turn captions on using the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Second, I want to take a moment to extend our thoughts and prayers to the people of Ukraine in the midst of Russia's horrific invasion. CAP's recommendations to the Biden administration in this time of crisis can be found on our website, americanprogress.org, and I encourage all of you to take a look. This morning, we published a new report documenting some of the steps the Biden administration has taken in its first year to protect religious liberty at home and around the world. Today's event will discuss the significance of the administration's steps, as well as what the administration can accomplish for religious liberty over the remaining 3 years of President Biden's term in office. We are honored to have with us the Honorable Rashad Hussain, the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, who will kick us off with a keynote address, after which we will turn to a panel discussion by several leading religious freedom advocates. Ambassador Hussain is the first ever Muslim to serve in this role. As ambassador, he serves as the principal advisor to the Secretary of State and advisor to the President on religious freedom conditions and policy, and leads the federal government's efforts to monitor religious freedom abuses, persecution, and discrimination worldwide. Ambassador Hussain previously served as director of the National Security Council's Partnerships and Global Engagement Directorate, as senior counsel at the Department of Justice's National Security Division, and as the U.S. Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, as well as U.S. Special Envoy for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, and as Deputy Associate White House Counsel. In his roles as envoy, he advised on foreign policy issues and worked with multilateral organizations to expand partnerships in education, entrepreneurship, health, and international security, science and technology, and other areas. He also spearheaded efforts on countering anti-Semitism and protecting Christians and other religious minorities in Muslim-majority countries. Ambassador Hussain, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Maggie. It's so nice to be welcomed by such a good friend, such a brilliant scholar. I appreciate all of your work over the years, and very delighted to join you here at the Center for American Progress as you review the Biden-Harris's early record on advancing religious freedom. I'm proud to say that the world continues to look to the United States for leadership in defending religious freedom in the face of major challenges around the world. A large part of the credit for this leadership goes to our civil society partners like you. So let me just start off by thanking you for your vigilance, your persistence, and your continual efforts to hold U.S. leadership accountable on a whole host of important human rights issues. These are issues that are very important to me, very personal to me, issues that I've been passionate about throughout my entire career, and they're issues that the President and the Secretary of State feel very strongly about. And we feel very strongly about the importance of continuing to uphold American leadership in this area. The administration has been clear from the beginning that we stand with you on the importance of freedom of religion and belief and for advocating for the most vulnerable and persecuted around the world. President Biden moved faster than almost any of his other predecessors in appointing an ambassador at large and to fill open positions on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. As he stated recently, my administration remains steadfast in our efforts to lead and advance human rights, including the freedom of religion around the globe, at a time when many people are subject to horrifying persecution for their faith and beliefs. The United States sends a powerful signal, I believe, to the entire world by making international religious freedom a significant human rights priority. And we send a powerful signal with our overwhelmingly bipartisan support for protecting international religious freedom. And I also believe that it's a powerful signal that the most recent ambassador at large, the holders of this office, have been a Black Protestant minister, a Catholic, a Jewish rabbi, now a Muslim American. So how is this commitment translated into action around the world? Let's consider some of our most significant actions to date. Our partners have warmly welcomed the administration's multilateral approach to advocating for changes in policies that violate the right to freedom of religion or belief worldwide. Perhaps the best example of this is the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance. With the addition of several new countries over the last year, the alliance now boasts 35 member nations, with more expected to join very soon. Members of the alliance sign on to a declaration that everyone has freedom to believe or not believe, to change faith, to meet alone for prayer or corporately for worship. In the last few months alone, the alliance has spoken out forcefully in support of the rights of repressed Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide, Christians and other religious minorities at risk in Afghanistan, and members of religious groups under threat in several additional countries. Strong diplomatic and political measures often follow these statements. You may also recall the outstanding success of the first annual Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom, convened in Washington with my predecessor, Ambassador Sam Brown, back in 2018. That vision continues to this day, with the United Kingdom planning to host the fourth iteration in July. The event brings together senior government leaders and civil society representatives from around the world to discuss ways to better advocate for freedom of religion or belief for all. It also focuses on promoting and protecting the related rights to freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. Our UN ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield, has directly raised freedom of religion or belief on the UN floor several times already. Last April, the United States hosted an event commemorating the 10th anniversary of the UNHCR Resolution 1618, combating religious intolerance. No other country had done so since 2019. You may recall, I previously served as President Obama's special envoy to the OIC, and the first assignment that I had in that role was to move past a resolution that had gone forward at the UN General Assembly every year and in the Human Rights Council on what the OIC had called a resolution to combat the so-called defamation of religions. We disagreed, of course, with that approach because it violated our First Amendment principles by allowing for restrictions on speech and for giving sanction to blasphemy laws and apostasy laws, which we oppose. And so we worked with a number of countries around the world. We worked directly with diplomats at the UN Human Rights Council and at the UN to move past that criminalization approach and toward an approach that protects our free speech values. And the result of it was a 1618 process, the Istanbul process, which attempts to address underlying causes of intolerance rather than criminalizing speech. One of the US government's strongest contributions to the struggle for religious freedom is the annual International Religious Freedom Report we produce about each country. Our goal with these reports is to present all relevant information as objectively, thoroughly, and fairly as possible. In their pages, you can see the rich fabric of stories which help us understand the experiences of individuals and communities. These reports show the great personal cost of just exercising one's freedom of religion or belief. Sometimes we must detail painful experiences of discrimination, abuse, torture, disappearance, even the death of loved ones for simply trying to live lives in accordance with people's most basic values and beliefs. But the reports also capture stories of the courageous people who fight back. These are the heroes across the globe willing to challenge repressive regimes, counter extremist violence, and build coalitions despite religious and ethnic divides. These powerful coalitions can help combat discrimination, demand rights, and promote shared values of human dignity, mutual respect, and peace. And the reports have a strong impact on US policy. For the first time, the Secretary of State designated Russia as a country of particular concern last November for its particularly severe violations of religious freedom. In fact, I recently had the honor to meet with Metropolitan Epiphany, head of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I reiterated our country's steadfast support and pledged to work with partners to counter Russia's weaponization of religion there. The administration has imposed clear costs on the government of the People's Republic of China for its egregious crimes and violations of religious freedom. The United States placed strong financial sanctions, visa restrictions, and other deterrence measures on 10 of its officials. These officials have been directly involved in the ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity, targeting predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and members of other religious and ethnic groups. In addition to other concrete actions, there are also stronger export and import restrictions and multilateral initiatives that are also underway. We declined to send diplomatic or official representation to the Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games in Beijing, given the PRC's ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang and other human rights abuses. We continue to raise our concern about the treatment of Uyghurs, both in private and through vocal public messaging, encouraging other nations to join us. We must give a voice to this vulnerable population, as well as other communities whom the PRC targets, such as Tibetan Buddhists, Christians, and Falun Gong practitioners. Many of our allies have joined us in these actions. We stand in defense of religious freedom, of course, not only as an expression of our deepest values, but also because we believe it's a vital national security priority. Repression, which stifles religious freedom, also undermines political stability and economic development. Without religious freedom, people can't make their fullest contribution to their country's successes. And whenever a government tries to deny this human right, it ignites tension and it breeds division. Sadly, these results can be seen today in so many parts of the world, and all communities have experienced it somewhere. Christians, Sunni and Shia Muslims, Ahmadi Muslims, Jews, Baha'i, humanists, and atheists. All people everywhere are entitled to this human right, no matter where they live, what they believe, or what they don't believe. We find embattled Muslim minorities struggling for survival, including the Rohingya in Burma, as well as in the PRC and other parts of Asia. I've devoted much of my career working for freedom of religion or belief for religious minorities living amongst Muslim majority countries, whether that's in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, or in northern Nigeria. I'm particularly proud of our ongoing engagement in West Africa and the Sahel region. Last December, we convened religious leaders and experts on Nigeria and Mali to discuss how to mitigate the weaponization of religion in each country. I made my own first visit abroad in this position to Mauritania a few weeks ago. There I had the opportunity to address hundreds of delegates from across the continent at the African Forum for Peace, an important event with leaders, including significant youth and women representatives from across the continent to address security and human rights issues. I also followed up in private discussions to advocate for this right with the presidents of Mauritania and Niger, and had the opportunity to speak with students and civil society from all around the region. But the example needs to start at home. As a native Texan, I watched with horror when a gunman held 4 worshipers, including the rabbi, hostage at Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville last month. Anti-Semitic attacks are, of course, direct attacks on religious freedom. We have witnessed an alarming rise in anti-Semitism around the world for close to 2 decades now. I've spoken out strongly on this deadly hate throughout my career, and the Biden-Harris administration is deeply committed to combating anti-Semitism. We will continue to fight for a day when attending synagogue to pray does not, in fact, require an act of courage. In this effort, I look forward to working with Dr. Deborah Lipstadt as a special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism as soon as she is confirmed. And I know that she'll receive broad bipartisan support. In the domestic space, I can't say enough about the excellent work that the Center for American Progress is doing in engaging with civil society, including religious actors and people of faith. Some of these vital conversations have focused on building our post-pandemic economy, tackling the climate crisis, and fighting discrimination. You understand instinctively that we need everyone at the table for our work to be effective, and I applaud you for that. In short, the Biden-Harris administration prioritizes the freedom of religion or belief and is sparing no effort to defend it globally. We've seen the greatest success when we join together across lines in this greater cause for freedom. In this moment in history, that freedom is desperately needed in so many places, and we must stay united. Let me again thank the Center for American Progress for this opportunity and for all your determined efforts in this area. I look forward to the day, of course, when we can meet in person, but I trust that you'll continue to look to me and my team as your partners in this vital effort. So please stay in touch, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hussain, for your remarks. We're so grateful for your leadership on international religious freedom. It's an honor to hear about your vision in this new role as a means for America to live up to its values and to protect the security of so many groups under threat. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
I'd like to turn now to our panel discussion with several other leading religious freedom advocates. On his very first day in office, President Joe Biden rescinded the Muslim ban, a consequential step that set the tone for the administration's approach to religious liberty to date. The Biden administration has taken a number of additional steps within its first year by addressing Trump-era regulations that undermined religious liberty, seeking to protect religious communities from white supremacist violence, protecting sacred lands for Indigenous communities, advancing the rights of religious communities under threat around the world, and more. Yet public discourse on religious liberty too often focuses on the narrative of the religious right, which has distorted the principle of religious freedom as a means of overriding laws and regulations which might protect our public health in a pandemic or prevent discrimination against LGBTQ people and more. But religious freedom should never be about using religion as an excuse to harm others. It is centrally about ensuring that all people have the freedom to worship or choose not to worship without fear. It is about protecting the rights and safety of religious minority groups, including the non-religious here and around the world. And our hope is that this event today and our accompanying report will help refocus our national policy agenda on religious freedom through a reflection on the Biden administration's actions during its first year. So the format of today's panel is as follows. I will introduce each of our speakers as I pose questions to each of them in turn. I'll then pose a few questions to the entire panel, as well as open it up to questions from the audience. The audience is invited to submit questions anytime during the program. So I'd like to start this next portion off with Rabbi Jack Moline, President of Interfaith Alliance. In a career spanning 4 decades, he has established himself as a powerful voice fighting for religious freedom for all Americans, regardless of their faith or belief system. As a rabbi, he has worked to create common ground between people of diverse religious and secular backgrounds. As an advocate, he has led efforts to protect religion and government from each other, promote marriage equality, and especially protect civil rights for people of all faiths and sexual orientations. Jack, we heard from Ambassador Hussain about the administration's agenda on international religious freedom. What should a domestic agenda on religious freedom look like, and what challenges do you find with the current public narrative on religious freedom?
Maggie, thank you. I'm so delighted to be here and to be with this distinguished panel. I appreciate being included. Look, I would say that we're tempted to make any agenda a negative agenda, and I'm certainly going to do that. But I want to begin by saying that people of faith have been motivated to help this country move in the right direction to make progress towards civil rights and freedom for its entire history. And that remains the main task of people of faith. But I think the agenda that the domestic team needs to look at is this. First of all, we have to take back a true understanding of religious freedom. It is not permission to cry that I have deep personal beliefs and therefore I'm exempt from this or that aspect of the law. It is instead guaranteeing that there is non-discrimination in business and in employment, in the same way that there's non-discrimination in housing and education, at least on paper in this country. It is a requirement that the government and our society have a default neutrality on religion with reasonable accommodation that does not abridge the freedoms of others to observe their own faith traditions and to move freely through society. It is peeling back, if I can use a word from my own tradition, it's peeling back the chutzpah, the hubris of pretending that there is a secular purpose in limiting access to all kinds of healthcare, especially for LGBTQ individuals and women, and in limiting the rights that people of all orientations have to their full civil liberties. And it is returning to constitutional standards of the separation of church and state, rather than playing a game of trying to create an excuse for people to place their personal beliefs over the requirements of our collective responsibilities and rights. I know you're going to ask us a little later about hate crimes and Christian nationalism, so I won't go into that now, but that would be part of the agenda as well.
Thank you so much for grounding the conversation with that. I'd like to bring in next into the conversation Sumaya Waheed, Senior Policy Counsel at Muslim Advocates. She is a policy expert with over 15 years of experience in progressive legal and policy advocacy at the local, state, and national levels. Her work has covered issues from the criminal legal system to workers' rights, racial justice, and tax policy. She previously served in organizations such as the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and at Color of Change, and she led the All In for Washington campaign to reform Washington State's tax code. Sumaya, as we discussed, one of President Biden's first acts in office was to repeal the Muslim ban. Why was this such a significant step for religious freedom? And why did the president also call for Congress to pass the No Ban Act, which incidentally was introduced in the House 1 year ago to this day?
Thank you, Maggie, and thanks to the Center for American Progress for hosting this important conversation. As we all know, the Muslim and Africa bans were cruel, bigoted policy with no relation to security or any sort of benefit to our country. And they are part of a long history of exclusionary policies in the US that target specific populations based on hate that is deliberately stoked in working class whites to distract from the real sources of their problems. And Trump, the candidate, expertly deployed this as a campaign tool. So as we know, he said that he would impose a complete and total shutdown on Muslims entering the country. He then later doubled down on that and said, I think Islam hates us. Never mind that it didn't make any sense. It worked. He sailed on hate all the way to the White House and moved swiftly to make good on his promises. And I want to note that in 2016, when the candidate Trump said those hateful comments, it coincided with a spike in anti-Muslim hate crimes. So even if he didn't mean it, even if he hadn't won, he's just by saying what he said, he caused tangible harm to our communities. So in contrast, Biden, now President Biden as a candidate, promised to do the opposite, to rescind the Muslim and Africa bans and to sign the No Ban Act if it reached his desk. So his actions and his actually taking the step on his first day in office to rescind the ban was not just a necessary end to an awful policy. It was an important step to reset that balance, to say that rampant hate mongering is not okay, anti-Muslim hate is not okay, and then of course acting to make sure that it was no longer the law of the land in that arena. Now the reality is that anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim hate, and honestly, just white supremacist sentiment is still rampant in our politics. And if anything, it's worse now. So a future president could still harness that power and enact another discriminatory ban. So that is why it is so important that Congress act to pass legislation such as the No Ban Act that would prevent another president from making an exclusionary policy that discriminates on religion.
Thank you so much, Sumaya. I want to pivot to some additional regulations by the Biden administration and bring into the conversation Elizabeth Reiner-Platt, who is the director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School, a law and policy think tank that advances social justice, freedom of religion, and religious pluralism. She is a leading expert on the intersection between religious freedom and sexual and reproductive liberty and equality rights. Previously, she was a Carr Center for Reproductive Justice Fellow at A Better Balance, where she worked to pass paid family leave, paid sick leave, and pregnancy accommodations laws. So Liz, one of the administration's most significant undertakings has been to review over 25 Trump-era regulations that welcomed the misuse of religious liberty to discriminate against LGBTQ people, religious minorities, and people seeking reproductive health care. What steps has the administration taken so far to undo these harmful regulations? And why is that effort so significant in protecting religious freedom?
Absolutely. Thanks so much. So I'm going to try to breeze through some of these Trump era regulations and what's been done about them. As you said, there are a lot of them. I can't get through all 25, But so Biden has taken steps towards, for example, reinstating a policy that Trump revoked that had required federal grantees providing social services, things like medical or mental health services, to notify their clients that they are entitled to a referral to a secular service provider if they wish. The administration has issued a notice of proposed rulemaking stating its intent to rescind another Trump-era regulation that allowed government contractors, including for-profit companies, to place religious conditions on their workers and essentially make employment decisions based on religion. The administration has stated its intent to reverse a Trump-era religious exemption granted to federally funded child welfare organizations that had allowed these entities to deny services to families and children based on religion. And the administration has announced that regulations interpreting the Affordable Care Act are going to return to a policy of prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and it plans to revise the religious exemption provisions from that anti-discrimination rule. So, I think that kind of overarching thread that you can really see here just from these examples is that the Trump administration took a lot of steps to really enhance the religious liberty rights, and particularly of already powerful institutions. So employers, big government-funded service providers, healthcare systems, and these were granted really at the expense of the folks that we are usually trying to protect from discrimination. So workers, people who are in need of social services, foster care children and families, patients, and others. So in my mind, it really erodes rather than protects religious liberty, when in order to keep your government-funded job, you have to follow not your own religious beliefs, but those of your employer. Or to get government-funded services, you're going to be directed to a religious entity with no knowledge that you have a right to secular services. So there certainly is a lot more to be done just with regards to revoking all these Trump-era rules. And to, Rabbi Moline's point about kind of not just talking about negative policy agenda, I think we should also remember that there are plenty of areas for improvement kind of beyond just revoking all of these Trump policies when it comes to the protection of religious liberty. So, thanks.
Thanks so much, Liz. I'm looking forward to getting even more into that with you, hopefully in the remaining panel. I want to turn next to the Reverend Fred Davey, who serves on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, an independent bipartisan U.S. government commission dedicated to defending the universal right to freedom of religion or belief abroad. He also serves as senior strategic advisor to the president at Union Theological Seminary, where he had served as executive vice president for a decade and a senior advisor for racial equity at Interfaith Youth Corps. He is a renowned social justice advocate, faith leader, and public policy expert. Fred, the Biden administration made clear early on, as we heard reflected in some of the ambassador's remarks just now, that it sees religious freedom as necessarily interdependent with all other universal human rights. Can you explain why this approach is necessary and what it has looked like in action over the past year?
Sure. And Maggie, thank you for and you and the Center for American Progress for having me today. And I'm honored to be on this panel with such a great group of people and people who do important work here in the US and abroad. You are exactly right. All human rights are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. And these universal and individual freedoms overlap one another. We know at USERF, we cannot talk about religious freedom without also talking about freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of movement. It's helpful, to say the least, it is unhelpful, to say the least, to create a hierarchy within the human rights framework or to prioritize some rights over others. In our view, the Biden administration understands this and has sought to strengthen religious freedom within the larger human rights framework. It has done this over the past year on a global scale by including religious freedom as a fundamental right within US foreign policy. And I'll just talk about a few particular ways. Some of these will touch on areas that Ambassador Hussain mentioned earlier. But first, let me say that USERF is very pleased that the Biden administration moves swiftly to nominate and appoint well-qualified individuals in key positions. I had the honor and privilege of meeting our new ambassador at large for international religious freedom, who just spoke. I met Rashad last week, Ambassador Hussain last week in Washington, D.C., and we're really, really pleased that he's in this role. He mentioned Deborah Lipstadt, who has been nominated and had her Senate hearing, both as special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, and the Biden administration has granted the rank of ambassador to this position for the first time. So that's a very significant move the administration has made in this regard. And also in December, the administration appointed Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, Uzra Zaya, to serve concurrently as the special coordinator for Tibetan issues. So these appointments are really important steps that the administration has made to advance religious freedom within this broader context of human rights. But also over the past year or so, the administration has focused on, as Ambassador Hussain said, multilateral engagements and arrangements. He mentioned the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, which is a very important alliance that USCIRF and others have been involved in. But also, we should note that under this category of multilateral engagements, USCIRF recommended the US government prioritize religious freedom or belief in its renewed engagement with the UN human rights system. And in March of last year, the State Department announced that it would seek to rejoin the UN Human Rights Council. And at that session, the United States co-sponsored a resolution in the council on freedom of religion or belief. And then, of course, in October of last year, the United States was elected to serve on the council for the next term. So that example of multilateral engagement is one that we consider a very important move on behalf of by the Biden administration. I'd also just want to say a word about sanctions that have proven really important in guaranteeing religious freedom of belief internationally. Of course, we all know, as the ambassador mentioned, about the sanctions imposed on Chinese officials using the Global Magnitsky Act, particularly on officials who've committed or are responsible for the commitment of atrocities against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang. But in addition to that, in September of last year, the Treasury Department sanctioned 4 Iranian intelligence operatives for attempting to kidnap an Iranian American activist living in Brooklyn who advocated for Iranian women's freedom to choose whether or not to wear Islamic headscarves. And again, we believe the use of sanctions by the Biden administration to address issues of religious freedom or belief are very powerful and important steps and actions to take in this regard. Just one more area that I'd like to highlight, and that is the importance of the administration's focus on vulnerable populations. As the ambassador mentioned, there is ongoing focus on the issue of Uyghurs in China, obviously, as there should be, and other religious minorities, religious groups in that country. But in addition, USCIRF has focused a lot on religious prisoners of conscience. USCIRF has recommended that that U.S. government officials press foreign governments for the release of religious prisoners of conscience. And over the last year, the Biden administration and its officials have actively engaged on religious prisoner of conscience cases around the globe. The State Department publicly highlighted the cases of Pastor Rosales Fajardo in Cuba and imprisoned Jehovah's Witness Alexander Ivshin in Russia. It furthermore called for the release of all Jehovah's Witnesses imprisoned for practicing their faith and advocated privately behind the scenes on many different cases all around the world. So these areas, appointments, multilateral engagements, sanctions, and focused on vulnerable populations by the Biden administration over the last year have all contributed to the advancement of international religious freedom, our belief, within this larger human rights context. And we can say more about this, obviously, as the discussion continues. But thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this, this panel today.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of our panelists for being with us. I'm going to start with a few questions for the whole group, and then would love to turn it over to the audience for questions. But please, if you have a question already, go ahead and drop it into the Q&A function, and we will, as is noted in the chat, and we will be sure to get to those. So first, as has been mentioned a couple times so far, religious communities and houses of worship are frequently targets of white supremacist and other hate-motivated violence. Why is it important for advocates to address this as an issue of religious freedom? And maybe Jack, we'll turn it to you first.
It helps to unmute. Well, aside from the obvious that people are attempting to discriminate against people in the most extreme ways with physical violence and harassment in houses of worship, it's a religious freedom issue, because if the civil rights of people in this country are not protected in the places that are nearest and dearest to their hearts, the institutions that present a home for freedom of conscience, whether that's a religious conscience or a gathering place for people who are like-minded, then we're not good to the promises of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in general. So of course, this is a religious freedom issue. But it's also important that we are protecting these houses of worship, because so often, as you noted, they're coming from places of white supremacy and other hate-motivated violence that is itself pretending to the role of freedom of religious expression in this country. And it's simply intolerable. Just because someone is able to grab the language of discussion doesn't mean that they are accurate in the way that they're deploying it and weaponizing it.
Thank you, Rabbi Jack. And the only thing that I would add is, and it is obvious as well, that when our houses of worship are attacked, the entire community feels frightened, whether or not they were present when the attack occurs. And that in and of itself chills religious expression when folks are afraid to go to their mosque or their temple or house of worship, whatever it may be. And to put a finer point on it, the fact that anti-religious minority sentiment, whether it's anti-Muslim or anti-Semitic, the fact that this is normalized and is increasing in different spheres, including in our halls of Congress, means that these kinds of attacks are more likely to occur, and means that in order to stand up for religious freedom, our public officials need to stand and against those who would speak to those who would make anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim or anti-minority comments like this. Those who speak to hate need to face consequences. Otherwise, we will continue to see this normalization of Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and that will continue to lead to violence against marginalized communities.
And I would just pick up on the last point, and that is just to note that as America becomes a more diverse nation, it becomes a more religiously diverse nation. Some people have referred to it as the browning of America. I like to refer to it as America becoming more and more multi-ethnic, multicultural. And there's that growth has resulted in, or there's a corresponding target of religions, faith traditions, houses of worship that are represented by those groups who comprise the new growth and the diverse growth in the American population. So it goes to this question of who is legitimate in the country. And I think, as people seek to, as extremists, seek to delegitimize certain groups of people in the US, they do it by trying to delegitimize their religion and thus attacking worshipers and their houses of worship. And this is an issue of religious freedom and human rights, obviously, that we all need to stay vigilant on, particularly government here in the US.
Thanks to all of you for your responses on that question. And another means that folks are hoping to expand civil rights protections right now for a lot of targeted groups, including religious minorities, is through the Equality Act, which is currently awaiting action in the Senate. It would add sexual orientation and gender identity to the list of protected classes under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was passed in the House a year ago today. And what many people don't know is that that bill also expands religious freedom protections as well as protections for other classes. Why is this a bill that religious freedom advocates support alongside other civil rights groups? And let me turn to Liz.
So, I do want to recognize that I'm sure we all know, LGBTQ people and religious people aren't totally two separate groups. I mean, I think the latest study shows that about half of LGBTQ people are religious, and more might be considered like spiritual, but not religious. So there are ways in which having these LGBTQ anti-discrimination protections itself enhances religious liberty. So if someone knows, for example, that they can't be fired for marrying their same-sex partner, then they might feel more able to live out their faith by getting married, to give just kind of one example. But I will also note that the Equality Act does expand legal protections against all forms of discrimination, including discrimination on the basis of religion. So the Civil Rights Act banned discrimination against customers in public accommodations in some settings. So that includes hotels and restaurants. But what the Equality Act would do is really expand those protections to cover a lot more places. So retail stores, healthcare providers, really crucially, banking services, legal services, transportation, among others. So, absolutely, I think it's really important that we talk about how this will provide greater protections across the board and increase people of faith's ability to live out their faith in the public square without fear of discrimination.
Thank you so much, Liz. I want to open us up now to some questions from the audience. We got one that says, given the religious rights domination of the religion space in politics these days, what can be done to highlight open and inclusive religious communities and bring their voices more to the forefront, in addition to panels like this, of course? And that question is for anyone here. And I would say, I would just add to it, why is it important for us to reclaim a progressive vision of religious freedom as well? Why do we need to do that work?
Well, I'll go ahead, Chad.
Fred, please.
So just quickly, it is really crucial that those of us who believe in a more inclusive and diverse society from a faith perspective really speak up and loudly, because I think the press, more likely than not, is going to focus on the religious right, because it tends to be more sensational, particularly in terms of how they express desires to exclude people rather than include. So I'm proud to be associated with a place like Union Theological Seminary that works really hard to advance a progressive notion and commitment to faith engagement, becoming an interreligious seminary in and of itself, rooted in a Christian tradition, or Interfaith Youth Corps, IFYC, that just yesterday promoted Black interfaith and the importance of understanding the ways in which Black people in America from a variety of faith traditions have worked together to advance things like civil rights and immigration laws, as Ibu Patel pointed out yesterday, that allowed immigrants like his parents to come to this country. So I think it's incumbent upon us who come from these more progressive traditions, who believe in a different vision of America, where diversity and pluralism are to be celebrated and highlighted, to be out front constantly and consistently promoting from a perspective of faith those things we adhere to and believe in.
And Maggie, what I would add to that is simply that's the mission that most of our faith communities adhere to as a matter of faith, to be cowed into remaining inside the four walls of a house of worship or a study because of the abuses of people who have weaponized being religious in this society and used it as a means of exclusion, is to be unfaithful to the very message that our founders sought to protect by placing freedom of conscience and protection from the imposition of religious faith at the very beginning of the Bill of Rights.
If I can add, the American Muslim community has been fighting for religious liberty since the first enslaved African was trafficked to this shore, and 20% of whom were Muslims. So the first enslaved African Muslim not being able to practice their faith. And our organization, certainly since its founding, has also been working towards religious liberty. And we've had successes in the past, and we've had our share of challenges, and our concerns, to my mind, haven't been afforded the same credence as some frankly outlandish claims that I'm seeing institutions accept, whether it's the courts or state legislatures across the country. So, and I would also say, even if you don't consider yourself a progressive, think about who you want to form alliances with and whether they're really standing for religious liberty or religious supremacy. And are they going to have your back, or are they going to stab you in the back?
Thanks, Samaya. Well put. My next question is regarding tribal communities. They're among those whose religious freedom rights are most at risk, in fact, particularly when it comes to threats to lands they deem sacred. Why was it so significant that President Biden reinstituted federal protections for the lands within the Bears Ears region in Utah? And Liz or Jack, if either of you wants to go first.
Liz, please.
Sure, I can hop in. So I actually just yesterday moderated a really incredible discussion on Native American religious liberty claims. And to me, one of the most disturbing aspects of religion law today is, while, as many people have said, we've seen this enormous expansion of free exercise rights when it comes to certain claims, including this, flood of claims related to conservative views about sex and sexuality, marriage, reproduction. The judiciary, for decades now, has just entirely failed to protect or really even to recognize claims by Native American tribes seeking to protect their religious practices, from total destruction. Courts have kind of just utterly failed tribes when it comes to the protection of sacred religious sites, which are at the heart and the crux of their faith practices. So I think it's enormously important for policymakers like the Biden administration to refuse to continue to allow the destruction of these sacred sites, which just has such an enormous impact. So, as you said, the administration has reinstated protection for barriers in Utah. It's now engaging in a new round of tribal consultation in Oak Flat in Arizona. And there's still kind of ongoing litigation and disputes around the Dakota Access Pipeline issue. So yeah, it's really a promising step, and I think incredibly necessary given kind of the unwillingness of the judiciary to take action.
I'd only amplify that by saying that the time is long past that the federal government should stop arrogating to itself the right to define what tribal values and priorities are. And And it's worth noting that even though I think most Americans would not consider this to be the defining conflict between Christian nationalism and minority faiths in the country, the fact is that the decisions of the Trump administration to appropriate those lands for commercial purposes and development is the best example I can think of how the values that inhere, and not necessarily negatively in American society in general, can be used in order to squelch the values that are supposed to be protected by American society.
Thank you so much to both of you. I have one last question from the audience, this one for Fred, before we turn into a concluding question for each of you. What specific measures do you think the US can do to protect religious freedom in more authoritarian countries like China and North Korea? Can we do more to open our doors to persecuted religious minorities?
So to the last question first, definitely can do more to open the doors to persecute religious minorities. USCIRF has recommended a change in one of the refugee regulations. I won't go into all the technical details. It's called a change in the P2 refugee regulation to allow more religious minorities, particularly from places like Afghanistan and other places where religious minorities are persecuted, into the US. And there is a letter soon that's going to go to President Biden reiterating this point about the need to do more to open our doors to persecuted religious minorities in other countries. A letter from USCIRF will go out probably later today to the Biden administration about that. As to the first part of the question, which I forgot, can you just repeat it?
Sure. What specific measures do you think the US can do to protect religious freedom in more authoritarian countries like China and North Korea?
Right. So I mentioned sanctions, and I think targeted sanctions through the Global Magnitsky Act are going to be key here, so that government officials, individuals, as well as governments, but individuals within these governments that are perpetrating and are responsible for these acts of oppression against religious minorities, particularly in a place like China, feel the impact of these sanctions and are held responsible as individuals for the actions they take. I think that is key in a place like China. North Korea is a little harder because it's such a closed country. USCIRF is working with different groups within South Korea to try to better aid religious people generally in North Korea who are actually jailed for any type of religious belief, for those who are able to get out, to assist them in various ways, but also to continue to highlight the dire religious oppression in a place like North Korea, and to work with the US government to try to use whatever leverage it has to bring about some degree of, or at least to begin to address and continue to highlight the oppression, religious oppression and oppression of belief in a country like North Korea.
Thank you so much. I have one question for each of you to close us out, if you can answer in just about 1 minute for each. This has been a tremendously helpful look back at the administration's first year on religious freedom, but of course there is a lot more to be done. We are in year 1 and we have 3 more to go within the administration's term. What are your recommendations for the Biden administration to do in its remaining 3 years? Whichever of you would like to go first.
Well, I'll go first and commend you, Maggie, for managing to fit so much stuff into 1 hour worth of conversation here. I think the Biden administration needs to do 2 things. On a positive level, they need to continue enfranchising the diverse communities of faith and philosophy that make up this nation, with an eye toward making sure that it is truly a large tent. On the negative side, they need to resist entirely the agenda and the rhetoric of Christian nationalism, which I want to emphasize is Christian in name only. It is not an expression of Christianity.
I'll take it from a fairly, one might say, self-interested point of view. But I think that the Biden administration, first of all, let me thank you, Maggie, and thank Cap and my friend Patrick Gaspard. I've known Patrick since he was a very young man. And so it's great to see him now as the president of Center for American Progress. But thank you for having me here today and for doing this panel. But let me just say, I think the administration should work with Congress to continue to, one, fund fully and multi-year funding for an agency like USERF. I think the administration should continue to make sure that there are diverse religious perspectives represented on USERF. It's great to see Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, Kazir Khan, Nuri Turkel, and others who come from non-Christian traditions or being on the commission and advocating for a variety of religious perspectives. Also, to continue to focus on religious minorities in various countries around the world that are not just Christian communities. Christians clearly are also being oppressed in many countries around the world, but there are many more religious minorities as well in countries around the world that the administration should and does and should continue to focus on. So those would be some things I'd recommend within the context of an agency like USERF that the administration continues.
So as a lawyer, I can jump in and fulfill my what I feel is my obligation to talk a little bit about kind of an elephant in the room, which is the Supreme Court, I think. We absolutely need to and should pass anti-discrimination legislation. We absolutely should and need to pass reproductive rights legislation and all these other important laws that we've been talking about. But, the Supreme Court is on a slash and burn mission, undermining kind of the very notion of anti-discrimination, the very notion of reproductive autonomy. And, right now, Justice Thomas is 73. Oliver Wendell Holmes was on the court till he was 90. So we could have this Supreme Court for another 10, even another 20 years. And by that time, I think our religious freedom, what religious freedom looks like could be, frankly, unrecognizable. And so what I would like to see, from the administration, certainly, but also just the broader advocacy community is some really deep planning and thinking about how on earth we protect religious liberty and all of our rights, given what we're seeing at the Supreme Court level. And that's a very big task. That's more than a 3-year program, but it's something I just felt like, we needed to kind of shine a light on.
Thank you. Following that is a bit tough because you did address the elephant in the room. I just want to say, anti-Muslim hate is currently a status quo. And so changing that requires commitment. And so we would like to see the Biden administration to eliminate racial and religious profiling from all federal law enforcement policies and practices. We've submitted a memo to the administration with specific recommendations, or are happy to partner with them on this. And then secondly, if a member of Congress can call one of the few Muslim Congress members a suicide bomber with no consequences, the president is uniquely positioned to call it out. So just as he did as a candidate on the Muslim ban and on his first day in office, drawing a line in the sand, he can publicly and unequivocally condemn public officials who engage in hateful rhetoric or actions, whether it's anti-Muslim or against any other marginalized community, and urge other public officials to do so as well. This will continue to be a problem, and he has a really important role to play. So we appreciate the work he's done and that the administration has done, and hope to see more of it. Thanks again for this panel.
Thank you so much. And thank you to each of our panelists and to Ambassador Hussain today for this rich discussion. Thank you to all of our audience members for being with us today. You can view the report that we have published today at the link provided in the chat, or go to americanprogress.org. Thank you again, and I wish you all a peaceful and a restful weekend. Bye-bye.